The Space Shuttle program was a program through the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, that was intended for reliable, repeatable, and cost-effective space traveling. The program ran from first liftoff on April 12, 1981 through final landing on June 8, 2011. Along these 30 years, 1 month, 3 weeks, and 6 days, there were both many triumphs and tragedies along the way. Shuttles did everything from build the International Space Station to space research. Shuttles did everything that was asked of them every time, repeatedly, reliably, and in a cost-effective manner. Research for the shuttle program began wheels up on August 12, 1977. On this day, a modified Boeing 747 carried a gliding craft up to 24,000 feet. The glider craft was then dropped and allowed to glide down to the runway in the middle of the Mojave Desert. This was the first successful landing at this landing strip of many more to come in the more than 30 years of the program. The first test of the gliding craft proved that the gliding craft would be an effective design for repeatable space travel, as it could land at a runway to be reused. This initial research led to more problems. Now that the shuttle could land, it had to find a way to make it up into orbit in the first place. This led to the design of the lifting body. The lifting body had just a few modifications over the gliding craft. The lifting body consisted of the main fuselage, the glider body, or orbiter as it is sometimes called, 2 booster rockets, and an external fuel tank. The rocket boosters and fuel tank were dropped off after liftoff. Part of the reusable design was the rocket boosters, as they were dropped off and used again and again, launch after launch.
Start, 2, 1, booster ignition, and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery, returning to the space station, paving the way for future missions beyond.
A little later into liftoff process, the fuel tank would be dropped as well, but it was not reusable like the orbiter body and the rocket boosters. The design of the main orbiter was a very important part of the space shuttle design. It featured a design based on the Martin Marietta X-24A with a double delta wing configuration. The double delta wing gave the craft its gliding ability. This design also featured a tail fin. A lot of these aspects added stability to the flight of the shuttle. On the very edge of each wing was a rudder called an elevon. The elevons controlled the pitch, which is the nose up and down motion of the craft, as well as the roll, which is the tilt on the axis of the craft. Another important aspect of the craft's aerodynamic design was the tail fin, or vertical stabilizer as it's sometimes called. On the tail fin was a rudder that was split into 2 parts. This split rudder controlled the yaw, which is the nose left and right direction of the craft. In addition to this, the rudder also aided in landing, as it was used as an air brake to create more air resistance and friction to slow the craft down on the runway. All of this was useful in Earth's atmosphere where there was air present that could be used to change the direction of the craft. The craft would require a completely different set of systems to make adjustments and corrections when there was no air, such as in space. When in space, the craft used many booster rockets placed along the outside of the craft to make adjustments to its course. There are many different systems used to adjust the craft. First was the OMS. Short for Orbital Maneuvering System, the OMS was 2 small jet engines on the rear of the craft which are used to guide the craft into and out of its orbit around Earth. Second was the RCS, the Reaction Control System. These controlled the roll, pitch, and yaw of the craft while it was in its orbit in space. Space shuttles were used for their functionality. They had to be very useful crafts. The functionality was a big part of the design of the space shuttle, since it was intended to build the International Space Station, conduct space research, and launch satellites. With its 60-foot by 15-foot cargo bay, coupled with a 50-foot robotic arm, the space shuttle could handle any task thrown at it. What was in the cargo bay changed almost every mission, whether it was a space research labs, parts for the International Space Station, or satellites that had to be launched. The space shuttle proved vital for further space exploration. Technology aboard the space shuttle was also a very important part, as it was used to help guide the unstable flying craft. The shuttle used new, more complicated flight systems and software than what had ever been used before. The shuttle's most advanced craft for its time. The shuttle also had groundbreaking technology that's still in use today, such as fly-by-wire technology. This allowed for pilots' inputs to be sent as digital signals to the rudders and such. Old systems used physical cables and pulleys to change the rudders and change direction of the craft. All of this required more complicated computing power. Providing that power was 4 IBM AP101B computers. These were pushed to their limits to achieve the task needed to fly the space shuttles. Since the space shuttle was a reusable spacecraft, it would have to be able to survive re-entry. Temperatures on re-entry could exceed 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. New innovation was required. NASA decided to wrap the skin of the aluminum space shuttles with silica-based tiles developed by the Lockheed Missile Company. On the craft, there was two different types of heat-resistant tiles: low-temperature reusable surface insulation, or LTRSI, and high-temperature reusable surface insulation, HTRSI. The difference being HTRSI had an additional ceramic coating for more heat resistance. The LTRSI did not have the ceramic coating. LTRSI were used on the top side of the craft where there was less heat upon re-entry. HTRSI was used on the bottom where there was a lot of heat on re-entry. There was a crucial flaw with these tiles, though. Extreme temperatures would get too hot and the tiles would fall off because the adhesive backing would melt off. This was not too big of a disaster until too many tiles fell off. That leads into some of the disasters of the Space Shuttle program. During liftoff of Columbia's last mission in 2003, when the fuel tank was dropped off, a piece of foam from the fuel tank struck the shuttle's wing, causing a few too many of the heat-resistant tiles to fall off. On February 1st, 2003, the shuttle made its approach for re-entry, and because it was missing too many tiles, the craft allowed hot gases to enter into the cabin, expand, making the shuttle explode. This killed all 7 crew members on board: Rick Husband, Michael Anderson, David Brown, Kalpan Chawala, Laurel Clark, William McCool, and Ilan Ramon. This was the second tragedy in the space shuttle era and eventually led to the end of the space shuttle program. Columbia was the first shuttle in space in 1981, and it had made 27 successful missions before, to on the 28th mission. The first disaster that occurred during the Space Shuttle program was the Challenger disaster. On January 27, 1986, lead engineer Bob Ebeling and his team went to NASA to tell them to cancel the Challenger's launch schedule for the next morning. They wanted to cancel because their research had shown that some of the O-rings on the shuttle's booster rockets would not seat right in the cold, and this was predicted to be the coldest launch ever. NASA didn't want to listen and wanted to prove that they were right. That night, Ebeling went home to tell his wife and said that the Challenger would explode the next morning. The next morning, on January 28, 1986, the Challenger had a successful liftoff. 73 seconds later, it exploded into a fireball, and all 7 crew were killed: Michael Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onzinka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, and Christian McAuliffe. Later that night, President Reagan gave his State of the Union address. He planned to brag about the success of the shuttle program. Instead, he was mourning the loss of 7 Americans along with the rest of the American people. On the Challenger's first mission in 1981, to the explosion of the Challenger in 1986, to the burning up of the Columbia in 2003, to the final successful landing in 2010, the space shuttles had a lot of triumph and tragedy throughout their history. They constructed the International Space Station, launched many satellites, including the Hubble Space Telescope, and did so much research for the future of the space program. The shuttles were a reliable and reusable method of space travel as they were intended, and they will have an everlasting impact on the space program as it is today.